The glass award felt heavier than I expected, its sharp edges cool against my trembling hands. On stage, under the warm lights of the town hall auditorium, the applause from 200 of my neighbors, friends, and former students washed over me like a warm tide. For 40 years as a home economics teacher, I'd poured my heart into this community. This award felt like a thank you. I looked out at the front row. My son Ben was clapping, a strained smile on his face. Beside him, his fiancée Chloe looked perfect and bored, her applause delicate and soundless. As the clapping died down, the mayor stepped back from the microphone, leaving it live. In the sudden quiet, Chloe's voice, a sharp, impatient whisper, carried through every speaker in the hall. "Can we get this over with?" she hissed to Ben. "If she sells the house, you can finally buy me a real ring instead of this community service diamond." A collective gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where all the warmth and pride had been just seconds before. I saw my son's face, not angry at her, but pale with his own mortification. He didn't defend me. He just looked trapped. That horrible whisper, broadcast for the whole town to hear, wasn't the start of the problem. It was the end of my silence. To understand how we got there, we have to go back to a Sunday dinner just 2 months earlier. That Sunday dinner 2 months earlier started the way they always had, with the scent of pot roast and onions filling the house. I had my heavy cast iron skillet on the stove, the same one my late husband Frank gave me for our first anniversary. He'd told me, "This thing will outlast us both, Elle. It just gets better with age if you take care of it." Over the years, its seasoned surface had become a dark mirror, holding the reflection of 1,000 family meals. It was more than just a pan. It was a promise of consistency, of warmth, of a home built to last. Ben was the first to arrive, looking like he always did lately, like a man trying to outrun a debt. He tossed his real estate blazer over a chair and loosened his tie, his sigh so heavy it could have sunk a ship. He kissed my cheek, but his eyes were already scanning the room, calculating square footage and comps instead of seeing the home he grew up in. "Market's brutal, Mom," he said, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Just lost a listing in the Heights. The buyers got spooked by the interest rates." I wanted to tell him that a house is more than a listing, that a home is built with love, not commissions. But I just patted his arm. "It'll turn around, honey. It always does. You're a good man, and people see that." He gave me a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then Chloe arrived. She didn't so much enter a room as make an entrance, a whirlwind of perfume, perfectly styled hair, and a bright, glossy smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She was holding a single, ridiculously expensive-looking orchid in a pot. "For the house, Eleanor," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful, to add a modern touch. She handed it to me, and I almost fumbled it. She called me Eleanor, never Ellie, and certainly never Mom. It was a small thing, a tiny grain of sand, but enough to make you feel an itch. I placed her sterile white orchid on a table near the window, where it looked completely alien next to my cheerful, unruly geraniums. At the dinner table, the trouble began, soft as a mouse at first. Ben was telling a story about a client who wanted a kitchen with a 6-burner Viking range and a built-in espresso machine. Chloe laughed, a tinkling sound like ice in a glass. "Of course. A kitchen is the heart of the home, but it's also a status symbol. You can't exactly impress people with, well, you know." She gestured vaguely with her fork toward my kitchen. My kitchen, with its cheerful yellow wallpaper that Frank and I had picked out together in '88. My kitchen, with its reliable GE stove that had cooked Thanksgiving turkeys for 30 years. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a feeling I'd been having more and more around her. I looked at Ben, waiting for him to defend the kitchen where he'd done his homework every night, but he just shoveled a piece of potato into his mouth and nodded. "She's right, Mom. It's all about the finishes now. Granite, stainless steel, open concept." My pot roast, which had been tender and savory just a moment before, suddenly tasted like ash. For the rest of the meal, Chloe continued her quiet assault, always disguised as a compliment. "This house has such wonderful bones, Eleanor. It's just a shame they built them with so many small rooms back then. It really closes off the space. I love these original hardwood floors. Can you imagine how they'd look sanded down and stained a trendy dark espresso color?" With every comment, she was erasing me. She was sanding down my memories, knocking down the walls of my life with Frank. The house wasn't a home to her. It was a project, an asset to be flipped. I was just a temporary tenant whose lease was about to expire. The final blow came as I was clearing the plates. "You know, Ben and I were driving through that new condo development over by the golf course," she said, examining her perfect nails. "They're lovely, full maintenance, security, even a pool. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." I stopped, my hands full of our best china. "I'm not worried, Chloe. I like mowing my lawn. I like my garden." She gave me a pitying smile, the kind you'd give a child who doesn't understand what's good for them. "But the property taxes on a place this size must be a real burden for you, Eleanor. On your own, I mean." Ben worries. A burden. The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. My home, my life, the place where I had raised the very man sitting across from me a burden. I looked at Ben again, my heart pleading with him. "Say something. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her this house is our history." He just stared down at his plate, tracing a pattern in the leftover gravy with his fork. He wouldn't meet my eyes. In his silence, he gave his answer. He agreed. I carried the plates into the kitchen and set them down on the counter. My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of the sink, the cold porcelain a shock against my skin. I could hear them in the other room, their voices low and conspiratorial. I looked at the old cast-iron skillet, still warm on the stovetop. Frank was right. It had outlasted him. It was built of stronger stuff. And in that moment, staring at its dark, dependable surface, I realized I had to be too. My love for my son had made me soft, but their disrespect was beginning to feel like fire. And fire, I knew, could make iron hard as steel. That fire didn't ignite all at once. It started as a low ember, a guarded warmth I had to protect from the cold drafts of my own doubt. For weeks after that Sunday dinner, I felt a shift in the foundation of my life, a quiet hardening. I found myself paying more attention, listening not just to the words being said, but to the spaces in between. And a few weeks later, Chloe came looking for fuel. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Ben had called, his voice strained with manufactured cheerfulness. "Mom, Chloe and I just did a massive Costco run. We've got way too much stuff, figured we'd drop some off for you." It was a transparent excuse. My son hadn't volunteered to bring me groceries since he was 16 and trying to borrow the car, but I played along. "Why, that's so thoughtful of you, honey." They arrived with a comical amount of groceries. Ben was huffing under the weight of a case of bottled water and a sack of potatoes, but Chloe glided in behind him carrying only a large bag of kale, as if it were a designer handbag. Her eyes weren't on me, they were scanning, appraising, the way a professional appraiser does at a garage sale, looking for the one priceless antique hidden among the junk. While Ben and I unloaded things in the kitchen, she drifted through the house. "Just stretching my legs," she called out. I heard her footsteps pause in the living room, then move down the main hallway. The hallway is the spine of my house. It's lined with photographs, Ben's toothless school pictures, my wedding portrait with Frank, candid snapshots from decades of summer vacations at the lake. It's a roadmap of a life lived, not just a space to walk through. I could feel her gaze on it all, and it felt like a violation. I left Ben putting a gallon of milk in the fridge and followed. I found her at the far end of the hall, standing before the door to Frank's old workshop. It was the only door in the house that was always kept locked. "Oh, silly me," she said, her hand on the old brass knob. She gave it a theatrical jiggle, the rattle echoing in the quiet hall. "I thought this might be the powder room." The lie was so bald-faced it was almost impressive. The guest bathroom was 30 feet in the other direction, its door wide open. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was testing boundaries, pushing on locked doors both literally and figuratively to see which ones would give. Ben came up behind us, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Oh, that's just Dad's old workshop," he said with a dismissive shrug. "Been locked since he passed, probably full of rusty saws and spiders." His casual ignorance was a dull ache in my chest. He had spent hours of his childhood in that room, watching his father work, handing him tools, learning how things fit together. Now, to him, it was just a closet full of spiders. Chloe's eyes, however, lit up with a predatory gleam. A locked room in an old house? To a mind like hers, that didn't spell spiders. It spelled secrets. It spelled value. "You should really air it out, Eleanor," she suggested, her tone dripping with false concern. "You could get mold, or it could be a fire hazard." I stepped forward, placing myself between her and the door. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I thought of my cast iron skillet, how its strength came from its solid, immovable weight. "Thank you for your concern, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly level. "But that door stays locked." The challenge in my tone was unmistakable. It was quiet, but it was there. Her smile tightened for a fraction of a second, the glossy facade cracking just enough for me to see the raw ambition underneath. Then it was back in place. "Of course," she chirped, "whatever you think is best." After they left, the house felt silent and invaded. The scent of her perfume lingered in the hallway. I stood in front of the workshop door for a long time, running my hand over the familiar wood grain. Then, from a small hook behind a framed cross-stitch sampler, I took down the old, heavy skeleton key. The lock turned with a satisfying, deep thud that I felt in my bones. I pushed the door open and was hit with the scent that was my husband's alone, a mix of old paper, warm electronics, and a faint, clean smell like ozone after a thunderstorm. Ben was wrong. There were no rusty saws. Frank's workshop wasn't for wood, it was for ideas. The room was exactly as he'd left it 10 years ago. Neat stacks of scientific journals lined one wall. On his large workbench, instead of tools, were strange, intricate objects. Prototypes of milky, flexible plastics, some as thin as film, others molded into complex shapes. Rolled-up chemical diagrams and blueprints were tucked into cubbies like ancient scrolls. It wasn't a handyman's hobby space, it was a laboratory. I walked over to his desk. Sitting right in the center, next to a photo of me and a 5-year-old Ben, was a single leather-bound journal. I picked it up, its weight familiar in my hands. I didn't have to open it. I knew what was inside. Page after page of Frank's precise, elegant handwriting, detailing years of failed experiments, small breakthroughs, and finally, the formula, the one he'd called his legacy. Chloe thought the value of this house was in its wood floors and property lines. Ben had forgotten its history altogether. They were both blind. They were hunting for treasure with a map that was all wrong. They didn't know the real inheritance wasn't the house itself, but the ghost in the workshop. And in that moment, holding Frank's life's work in my hands, I knew I would not let them haunt it. Holding that journal, the worn leather cool against my skin, it was like the last 10 years since he'd been gone just melted away. I wasn't a 72-year-old widow standing in a dusty workshop. I was back on a rainy Tuesday night in 1995, and Frank was alive. The rain was tapping a steady rhythm on the basement windows, a sound that always made our little house feel like the safest place on earth. It was almost midnight. I had just finished grading a mountain of home economics projects on sewing buttons and balancing a checkbook life skills I knew were more important than algebra, even if the school board didn't agree. I'd made a fresh pot of coffee, the smell of it dark and rich, and brought a mug down to the workshop for Frank. He didn't hear me come in. He was hunched over his workbench, a single gooseneck lamp illuminating his salt and pepper hair and the intense frown of concentration on his face. He wore his favorite red flannel shirt, the elbows worn thin, a smudge of something gray on his cheek. Frank was a chemical engineer by trade, but down here, in his sanctuary, he was a magician. He wasn't trying to turn lead into gold. He was trying to do something much harder. He was trying to create something that would last forever by harmlessly falling apart. He was so lost in his work that I had to touch his shoulder to get his attention. He jumped, a little startled, then his face broke into that wonderful tired smile of his when he saw it was me. "Ellie," he breathed, his eyes bright with an exhaustion so deep it looked like excitement. I think this is it." He took the coffee mug from my hands, his own calloused and stained, and set it down without drinking. He was buzzing with an energy that filled the entire room. For the last 5 years, he'd been chasing this idea, this crazy notion that you could make plastic from organic compounds, something that would be as strong as the real thing but would return to the earth when you were done with it. He'd filled notebooks, spent our modest savings on lab equipment from surplus catalogs, and endured more than a few jokes from his colleagues at the plant. He gestured to a beaker filled with a thick, amber-colored liquid. It didn't look like much. It looked like honey left out in the sundae. "They all said the polymer chain wouldn't be stable enough," he said, his voice a hushed, reverent whisper. "They said it would be too brittle, but they weren't thinking about the cross-linking agent. Look." He picked up a small, thin sheet of plastic from his desk. It was clear and flexible. He handed it to me. It felt like regular plastic wrap, but warmer, softer somehow. "That came from the batch I made last night," he said. "It's strong, it's waterproof, and according to my projections in a landfill, it would degrade into nothing but water and biomass in under a year." I didn't understand the science, not really, but I understood him. I saw the years of frustration and late nights culminating in this small, simple square of plastic in my hand. I saw the genius he was too humble to ever claim for himself. Then he opened the leather journal, the one I was holding now in the present day. He turned to the last written page. There, in his familiar neat script, was a long, complex chain of chemical equations. He'd drawn a firm, confident box around the final one. "This is it, Elle, the final formula." He looked up at me, and the exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clear, profound sense of purpose. "This won't make us rich now. The big oil companies have the plastics market in a chokehold. It'll be years before anyone is willing to invest in something like this. Maybe not even in our lifetime." He ran his hand over the page, a gesture full of tenderness, as if he were stroking the face of a child. "But one day," he said, his voice dropping low with conviction, "the world is going to need this. They're going to realize we can't just keep burying our trash and hoping it goes away, and when they do, this will be important." He closed the journal and placed his hand over mine on the cover. His gaze was so intense it felt like he was trying to imprint the moment onto my soul. "Promise me something," he said. "When the time comes, when this thing is finally worth something, promise me it will do some good. Don't just let it make some corporation richer. Use it to build something, a scholarship, a program, something that gives a smart kid who doesn't have a chance the same shot we had. Promise me it will be an inheritance of character, not just cash." The rain tapped against the glass. The old dehumidifier in the corner hummed its steady tune. I looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the journal under our hands. It wasn't just a formula. It was his belief in the future, his faith that people could do better. It was the best part of him, distilled onto a page. "I promise, Frank," I whispered. "I promise." The memory faded, leaving me alone again in the silent, dusty workshop. The air was cool now, but I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine. I clutched the journal to my chest. It felt like a shield. Chloe could scheme for the house. Ben could forget his own history. They didn't understand. I wasn't just protecting a piece of property. I was guarding a promise, and some promises are built to last forever. Holding Frank's promise in my heart felt like carrying a shield. I knew I would need it, because the assault didn't come with a battering ram and a shout. It came softly, disguised as love, delivered with the smiling, concerned faces of my own family. The pressure campaign began with the phone calls. Ben would call me on his drive home from work, the sound of traffic hissing in the background. "Just thinking about you, Mom," he'd start, his voice laced with a careful, rehearsed casualness. "You know, the roof is going to need replacing in a few years. That's a big expense. And the lawn service guys are charging a fortune these days." Every conversation was a gentle chipping away at my sense of security, a subtle suggestion that my life was too big for me to handle. He never mentioned selling, not directly. He just laid out a trail of breadcrumbs, expenses, repairs, worries, hoping I would follow it myself to the conclusion he and Chloe had already reached. Each time, I'd listen patiently before changing the subject. "My garden is doing beautifully, Ben. My heirloom tomatoes are coming in." I was speaking a language he no longer seemed to understand. The campaign escalated at a backyard barbecue Ben and Chloe hosted a few weeks later. It was a perfect suburban Saturday, the air thick with the smell of grilled burgers and the sound of children laughing in the yard next door. It all felt so wholesome, so American, which made the ambush feel all the more jarring. I was sitting with one of Ben's colleagues when he came over, beer in hand. "Mom was just telling me her property taxes went up again," he said to his friend, a complete lie. "It's getting crazy. A woman her age shouldn't have to worry about being taxed out of her own home. It's a burden." There it was. That word again. Burden. Chloe's word coming out of my son's mouth. It was a poison dart, and it hit its mark. I saw the look of pity on his colleague's face. In an instant, I was no longer Ellie Vance, retired teacher and sharp-witted woman. I was a category. An elderly problem to be managed. I smiled, a tight, brittle thing. "The only burden, Ben, is listening to you worry so much." My voice was light, but my grip on my plastic cup was white-knuckled. The worst of it, the absolute peak of their condescending crusade, happened in the one place you can't escape the raw, overwhelming reality of American life, Costco on a Saturday morning. Chloe had insisted I come, that I needed to stock up. Pushing a shopping cart through those cavernous aisles feels like navigating an ocean liner. The sheer scale of everything is meant to overwhelm you. 10-pound bags of coffee, gallons of mayonnaise, flat-screen TVs the size of a garage door. For Chloe, it was a stage, and the oversized products were her props. "Eleanor, look!" she'd sing out, holding up a value pack of Boost nutritional shakes. "These are perfect for when you don't have the energy to cook a whole meal." I stared at the picture of the smiling, silver-haired senior on the box, then back at her. I had just made a 3-course meal from scratch for 20 people at a church potluck last week. "I think I'll stick with my pot roast, dear," I said, pushing my cart past her. She was relentless. She'd stop by the pharmacy section, loudly discussing the benefits of medication organizers and emergency alert buttons. She paused for an eternity in the aisle with the walk-in tubs and lift chairs, tracing the picture on the box with a perfectly manicured finger. "It's just about planning for the future, Eleanor, being practical." Ben, meanwhile, was like her shadow, nodding in agreement, adding his own commentary. "She's right, Mom. A little fall could be a big deal." The final straw came when we reached the electronics section. Chloe made a beeline for a display of home security systems. "Oh, this is perfect for you," she exclaimed. "With cameras and everything, we could even get the app on our phones just to check in and make sure you're okay." The image it conjured was suffocating. Me, a prisoner in my own home, watched through the cold, digital eye of a camera, my every move monitored by them. My life reduced to a video feed on Chloe's iPhone. It wasn't about safety. It was about surveillance. It was about control. I stopped my cart so abruptly a man behind me almost ran into it. I turned to face them, right there under the harsh, fluorescent glare of the television display. "I am going to say this once," I said, my voice low and steady, a strange calm settling over me. "My health is fine, my mind is fine, and my life is not a problem for you to solve." Chloe's smile faltered. Ben had the decency to look ashamed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find the words she hadn't fed him. I steered my cart away from them, toward the checkout. I didn't need a 10-pound bag of anything. I didn't need their help or their concern or their suffocating plans. I paid for a rotisserie chicken and a single bag of coffee. As I walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the parking lot, I felt that ember of resolve inside me glow a little hotter. They thought they could wear me down, that they could chip away at me until I crumbled. They didn't understand the promise I was keeping. It wasn't just a shield, it was a spine of steel. And it was getting stronger every day. A spine of steel is no good if you just stand there and take the hits. It's meant to hold you up while you move, while you plan. And after the disaster at Costco, after being treated like a confused child in the cavernous temple of American bulk buying, I knew I couldn't just play defense anymore. My son and his fiancée were waging a war of attrition, hoping to wear me down with 1,000 tiny cuts of concern. It was time to formulate a strategy of my own. That evening, the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the small wooden desk in my kitchen, the one where I'd paid bills and written letters for 50 years. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out my old address book. It was a worn, blue leather-bound book, the pages soft and thin from decades of use. The edges were filled with names crossed out, new addresses scribbled in, a tangible history of a life's connections. Chloe, with her smartphone and her thousands of digital friends, would probably see it as a relic, but I knew it held something far more valuable than a contact list. It held a record of earned respect. I flipped through the brittle pages past the names of old friends and neighbors until I got to the C section. And there he was, Chen, David. I smiled, remembering him. A lanky, quiet boy with glasses too big for his face, who sat in the back of my 9th grade home economics class. He'd been hopelessly clumsy, once sewing a potholder directly to his shirt sleeve, but he was incredibly bright and always unfailingly polite. The address was his parents' old house, but underneath, I had neatly penciled in an update from a Christmas card a few years back. Chen and Associates, Patent Law. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the phone and dialed the number for his office. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Chen and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. David Chen, please." I said, my voice calm and clear. "Tell him it's his old home ec teacher, Mrs. Vance." There was a moment of confused silence, then a click as I was put on hold. A minute later, a voice came on the line that was deeper and more confident than the one I remembered, but held the same gentle warmth. "Mrs. Vance? Is that really you?" "It is, David. I hope I'm not interrupting." Never," he said, and I could hear the genuine smile in his voice. "For the woman who taught me how to balance a checkbook, I have all the time in the world. To what do I owe the honor?" "I have a small legal matter I was hoping to get some advice on," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I'd be happy to make a formal appointment." "Nonsense," he said immediately. "How about coffee? Tomorrow morning, that little place on Main Street, the Daily Grind? My treat." The next morning I sat in a booth at the back of the cafe, the air rich with the smell of roasting coffee beans and steamed milk. I watched David walk in. The clumsy boy was gone, replaced by a man in a perfectly tailored suit who moved with an easy confidence. But when he saw me, his face broke into that same familiar, slightly shy smile I remembered. He slid into the booth opposite me. "Mrs. Vance, you haven't aged a day. You're a terrible liar, David, but a very good lawyer, I hear." We made small talk for a few minutes, catching up on the years. He told me about his wife and 2 young daughters. I told him about my gardening. It was comfortable, easy. But I knew this wasn't just a social call. My internal monologue was running on a separate track, calculating, planning. I couldn't tell him about Ben and Chloe. Not yet. This wasn't a therapy session. It was an intelligence-gathering mission. Pouring out my family troubles would make me sound emotional, vulnerable. A victim. I needed to be a client. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a slim manila folder. I slid it across the table toward him. "As I said, I have a small matter I need help with. This is a copy of a patent filed by my late husband Frank back in 1996. David's professional curiosity was instantly piqued. He opened the folder and began to read, his brow furrowing in concentration. He was a fast reader, his eyes scanning the technical language and complex diagrams. I watched his expression shift from polite interest to focused intensity. He looked up from the page, his eyes sharp. "Mrs. Vance." "Eleanor," he said, correcting himself. "This is for a stabilized biodegradable polymer. The science here is remarkably prescient. This is the kind of green tech companies are spending billions to develop right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting his words hang in the air. "I'm aware," I said simply. Frank was ahead of his time. To say the least," he murmured, looking back at the papers. "Has this patent been maintained? Are the fees current?" Frank set up a trust to pay them for 50 years. He was a very meticulous man. David leaned back in the booth, a low whistle escaping his lips. He looked at me with a new kind of respect, the look a chess player gives an opponent who has just made a surprisingly brilliant move. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't just having coffee with his sweet old teacher. "What I need from you, David," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "is a discreet, comprehensive valuation. I want to know exactly what this piece of paper is worth in today's market. I need to know which corporations are working on similar technologies. I need to know everything, and I need it to be completely confidential." He nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing. "Of course, I can have a preliminary report for you within a week." He paused, his lawyerly curiosity getting the better of him. "Eleanor, if you don't mind me asking, why now? After all these years?" I met his gaze, and for the first time, I let a flicker of the steel inside me show. "Let's just say," I said, picking up my purse, "that I'm exploring my options for the future, and I believe in being prepared." I left him there with the folder and the bill he'd insisted on paying. Walking out of the cafe and back onto the sunny, familiar streets of my town, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a problem to be managed. I was a woman with a plan, and I had just put my first, most important piece on the board. In a game of chess, you place your piece, and you wait. You watch to see if your opponent understands the threat, if they see the board with the same clarity you do. It turned out they didn't see my move at all. They were too busy setting up a clumsy, obvious trap of their own. The phone call came a week after I'd met with David Chen, just as his confidential report, a thick, impressive document detailing the astonishing value of Frank's patent, arrived in a discreet courier envelope. "Mom, we need to talk," Ben had said, his voice tight with a forced seriousness. "Chloe and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your future, and we have some ideas. It's important. Can we come by this afternoon?" They arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, but they weren't alone. Trailing behind them was a man I'd never seen before. He was in his 50s, with silver hair so perfectly coiffed it looked like a helmet, and shoes so polished they reflected the worried look on my son's face. He carried a sleek leather briefcase like a weapon. "Mom, this is Mr. Davies," Ben said, avoiding my eyes. "He's a financial advisor, a friend of Chloe's family. He was kind enough to offer you a free consultation." An ambush. They had brought a stranger, a hired gun, into my home without so much as a warning. My living room, a space filled with the comfortable quiet of my life, Frank's worn armchair, the mantelpiece crowded with photos of a smiling, toothless Ben, was instantly transformed into a hostile boardroom. The air grew thin and cold. I didn't let my shock show. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Davies," I said, my voice even. I didn't offer him a seat. I made him stand there in the entryway for a moment too long, letting him feel that he was the intruder. Finally, I gestured toward the couch. Chloe immediately sat, prim and alert, like a student about to watch her prize-winning project be presented. Ben hovered near the fireplace, unable to get comfortable. Mr. Davies took Frank's armchair. The sight of this slick stranger settling into the worn indentations my husband had made over 30 years sent a hot spike of anger through me. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with 2 loud, aggressive snaps that echoed in the room. "Eleanor," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "Ben and Chloe have expressed some deep concerns about your financial security. An asset-rich, cash-poor situation like yours can be very precarious for a woman in your position." I steepled my fingers, my face a pleasant, neutral mask. Inside, I was dissecting every word. Asset-rich, cash-poor, precarious, your position. It was the condescending jargon of a predator trying to make his prey feel helpless. He pulled out a glossy brochure filled with pictures of smiling, white-haired couples on sailboats. "What I propose is a simple, elegant solution. We sell this property a seller's market, I might add, and transfer the capital into a managed trust. It would provide you with a generous monthly stipend for the rest of your life. No more worrying about taxes, repairs, or maintenance. All of your needs taken care of, with a significant remainder left over for your legacy." My legacy?" I repeated softly. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "He means for Ben, Mom. For your family." Mr. Davies smiled, showing a row of teeth that were a little too white. "Exactly, and to make things simpler, we would appoint a trustee to manage the account and make distributions. Someone you trust implicitly. We were thinking Ben would be the perfect candidate." There it was. The entire clumsy trap laid bare. Sell my home, hand over all the money. Make my son the gatekeeper. They wanted to turn my independence into an allowance, my life into a line item on a budget he controlled. They thought I was a doddering old fool who'd be dazzled by a glossy brochure and some financial buzzwords. They had no idea that tucked away in my desk drawer was a report from one of the best patent lawyers in the state, a report detailing a fortune that would make the value of my house look like pocket change. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I let the silence stretch out, enjoying the way Ben began to fidget, the way Chloe's perfect smile started to look glued on. "Mr. Davies," I said finally, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, "you mention a managed trust. What are your firm's annual management fees on an account of that size?" He blinked, a little thrown by the directness of the question. "Our fees are standard for the industry. A tiered percentage based on assets under management, typically around 1.5%. 1.5%, I mused, doing the math in my head. And that's before we discuss the capital gains tax on the sale of a primary residence that's been owned for over 50 years. That would take a significant bite, wouldn't it? Ben looked at me, his mouth slightly agape. I was his home ec teacher mom. I was supposed to know about sewing and baking, not capital gains. He had forgotten that I'd also taught a whole unit on household budgeting and taxes for 30 years. "Mr. Davies's oily smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Those are all details we can manage. The goal here is peace of mind, Eleanor." "My peace of mind is not for sale," I said, the words as crisp and clear as the autumn air. I stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Davies." "Ben, Chloe. It was so good of you to be so concerned." The dismissal was total. I had not shouted, I had not accused. I had simply refused to be the feeble-minded old woman they needed me to be. I had looked at their flimsy trap and declined to step in it. They gathered their things in a stunned, clumsy silence. Their brilliant plan, the one they had no doubt rehearsed and perfected, had been dismantled in under 10 minutes. As I showed them to the door, I saw the look on Chloe's face. The mask was gone. In its place was a cold, raw fury. She finally understood. I wasn't an obstacle. I was the opposition. When you show a predator you won't be their prey, they don't give up, they just get more vicious. After the spectacular failure of their little ambush, a cold war began. The carefully concerned phone calls from Ben stopped, replaced by a tense, brittle silence that felt heavier than any argument. I knew the final battle of this quiet, ugly war was coming. I just didn't realize they would choose to make it such a public spectacle. The invitation had arrived a month earlier, a thick, cream-colored cardstock from the mayor's office. I had been nominated for the town's annual Lifetime Community Service Award. When I'd told Ben, his reaction was lukewarm. "Oh, that's nice, Mom," he'd said, his voice distant. Chloe, however, had insisted they attend. "Of course we'll be there," she'd chirped. "We have to support you, Eleanor. We'll get a table right at the front." At the time, I'd mistaken her enthusiasm for a peace offering. How naive I had been. She wasn't planning to support me, she was planning to scout the battlefield. The award ceremony was held in the old town hall auditorium, a place that smelled faintly of floor wax and history. It was a sea of familiar faces, former students now grown with kids of their own, neighbors I'd exchanged pleasantries with over the fence for 30 years, friends from my church potluck committee. The warmth in the room was real, a comforting blanket of shared history. It felt like coming home. Ben and Chloe were already at their front row table, looking like a power couple from a magazine. He was in a suit that was a little too tight. She was in a sleek black dress that stood out against the cheerful floral print dresses of the other women. They were performing, and I was meant to be their supporting cast. When my name was called, the applause was long and genuine. I made my way to the stage, my heart swelling with a quiet pride. Mayor Thompson, a man I'd taught in the 10th grade, met me at the podium. He launched into a speech that was far too generous, talking about the thousands of students I'd taught, the bake sales I'd organized for the fire department, the community garden I'd helped start. "For 40 years, he boomed, his voice full of warmth, Eleanor Vance didn't just teach kids how to cook and balance a budget. She taught them about character. She taught them that what you build with your own two hands, with honesty and hard work, is what truly lasts. She is the bedrock of this community." He handed me the award. It was a heavy, flame-shaped piece of cut glass, cool and solid in my hands. It represented my life's work, my good name, my place in the only world I'd ever called home. I stepped up to the microphone, cleared my throat, and looked out at all those friendly, smiling faces. I saw Ben, clapping along, a strange smile plastered on his face. Beside him, Chloe clapped delicately, her eyes flicking toward the exit. She looked utterly, profoundly bored. The applause began to die down, and in that moment before I could speak, Mayor Thompson stepped back from the podium, accidentally leaving the microphone live. A fragile, expectant silence fell over the auditorium, and into that perfect silence, Chloe's voice sliced through the air like a shard of glass. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, a sharp, impatient hiss directed at my son, but the sensitive microphone picked it up and broadcast it to every corner of the room. "Can we get this over with?" she whispered. "If she sells the house, you can finally buy me a real ring instead of this community service diamond." Time seemed to stop. A collective gasp, a ripple of pure shock went through the crowd. 200 friendly faces turned to stone. The silence that followed was a physical thing, a crushing weight that pressed down on me, stealing the air from my lungs. The heavy glass award in my hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The warm stage lights felt like an interrogation lamp. I looked at my son. My son. He was staring at Chloe, his face a mask of pale, panicked horror. But there wasn't a flicker of outrage for me. There was no anger at her cruelty, no instinct to defend his mother. There was only the selfish, suffocating fear of a man who has just been profoundly embarrassed at a party. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He just sank a little in his chair, as if hoping the floor would swallow him whole. And in that hollow, ringing silence, watching my son fail the simplest test of love and loyalty, something inside me finally broke. Or maybe it wasn't broken. Maybe it was finally forged into something unbreakable. The hurt was a white-hot fire, but it burned away all the softness, all the excuses, all the hope that the boy I raised was still in there somewhere. All that was left was the cold, hard certainty of what I had to do next. I stood there on that stage, under the silent gaze of my entire community, holding the symbol of my life's character. And I knew, with a clarity that was both devastating and liberating, that I would not let them have it. Not the house, not the money, and not one more piece of me. The pre-written thank you speech, the one tucked into my pocket, felt like a relic from another life. It was written by a woman who thought her family was in the front row to celebrate her, a woman who still believed in the power of polite words. That woman was gone, vanished in the heat of a single cruel whisper. I let the folded paper stay in my pocket. I gripped the microphone stand instead, its cool metal grounding me, and I leaned in. The silence in the auditorium was a living thing, thick with shock and embarrassment. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, waiting. They were expecting tears, a flustered exit, a dignified collapse. They were about to be disappointed. I looked past the harsh stage lights to the front row. Chloe was frozen, a deer in the headlights of her own catastrophic mistake. Ben's face was ashen, his eyes pleading with me for... What? For me to smooth it over? To pretend it hadn't happened? To protect him from the consequences of his own choices, one last time? That was the moment the fire in my heart turned to ice. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson," I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified to fill every corner of the room. "And thank you, everyone. I am so honored to receive this award." I paused, letting the simple, expected words hang in the air. Then I pivoted. "This award is for a lifetime of service. It's about building a community and building a future." It reminds me of my late husband, Frank. He also believed in service. He also believed in building the future. I saw a flicker of confusion on Ben's face. This wasn't the speech I'd told him I was going to give. "Most of you knew Frank as a quiet engineer from the plant," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "But in his spare time, he was an inventor. He spent decades in his workshop, working on one big idea." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man in the third row lean forward, his expression intent. It was David Chen. He was here, just as I had asked him to be, a quiet guest, a silent witness. My strategist in waiting. Frank was a man ahead of his time. He invented something that the world wasn't quite ready for. He left behind a single, unassuming patent for a fully biodegradable polymer. The words meant nothing to most people in the room. But I watched Chloe's eyes narrow. The gears in her mind were turning, smelling value, even if she didn't understand the source. "For 30 years, that piece of paper sat in a locked room," I said, looking directly at my son and his fiancée. "Some might have thought it was just a dusty old relic, a fire hazard even." Chloe flinched, the color draining from her cheeks as I threw her own condescending words back at her. Ben's jaw went slack. "But the world changes," I went on, my voice resonating with a power I didn't know I possessed. "And an idea whose time has come is the most powerful force on Earth. That patent is now considered a foundational piece of green technology." A murmur went through the auditorium. People were starting to understand. This was no longer an acceptance speech. It was a revelation. Last week, at my request, a comprehensive valuation of that patent was completed by one of the top firms in the state. I let that sink in. I saw the look on Ben's face change from confusion to a dawning, sickening comprehension. The house, the property taxes, all their petty concerns were about to be vaporized. "And this morning," I said, delivering the final devastating blow, "I formally agreed to license that patent to a multinational corporation that will bring my husband's vision to the world." A collective gasp swept through the room. It was the sound of an entire town's perception of me shifting on its axis. I was no longer just Ellie Vance, the sweet old retired teacher. I was something else entirely. I watched Chloe's hand fly to her mouth, her perfectly constructed mask of poise shattering into a million pieces. Ben looked like he had been physically struck, his face a mess of shock, regret, and the horrifying dawning realization of the scale of his miscalculation. The proceeds from this agreement are substantial, I said, the understatement hanging beautifully in the air. And they will be used to fulfill a promise I made to my husband 30 years ago. Oh. I lifted the glass award, the symbol of my life's work, and held it up to the light. Frank and I believe that the greatest inheritance you can leave is not cash, but character. Which is why 100% of the proceeds will be used to establish the Frank Vance STEM Scholarship. It will provide a full 4-year college education every single year to a deserving graduate of our high school who wishes to pursue a degree in science or engineering. My husband's legacy will not be a bigger diamond ring. I paused, letting the words land with surgical precision. It will be a generation of new builders, new inventors, and new ideas. The silence that followed was a moment of pure, stunned awe. Then, someone in the back started to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, the applause thunderous, overwhelming. It wasn't just for the scholarship, it was for the beautiful, elegant justice of it all. Through the wall of sound, I looked at my son one last time. His face was a wreck, his eyes filled with tears of shame, and a loss so profound he was only just beginning to comprehend it. He finally saw me. Not as his mother, not as an obstacle, but as a force he had fatally underestimated. I gave a small, final nod to the audience, a queen dismissing her court, and walked off the stage, leaving the ruins of my son's future behind me. I didn't stay to watch the ruins smolder. I walked straight out of the side door of that auditorium, past the stunned faces of my friends and neighbors, and into the cool, clear night air. The thunderous applause still ringing in my ears felt less like a celebration and more like the sound of a controlled demolition. I had pushed the plunger, and an old, unstable structure in my life had finally come down. I expected sleepless nights, a heart heavy with a mother's regret. But what I found instead was peace. My house, the one they had viewed as a bargaining chip, felt like a sanctuary again. The next morning, I made myself tea and sat in the kitchen, listening to the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the first time in months the silence in my home hadn't felt lonely. It felt earned. But in today's world, you don't need to be in the room to watch a train wreck. The consequences, I would soon find out, traveled at the speed of the internet. It began with a call from David Chen around noon. His voice was a calm, professional hum against the storm that was brewing. "Eleanor," he said, "I thought you should know. Someone at the ceremony recorded your speech on their phone. The whole thing, the whisper, your response, everything. They posted it on the town's community Facebook page this morning. It's going viral, locally." He didn't need to elaborate. I could imagine it. Our small town was the kind of place where a story like that would spread like wildfire in a dry field. For the rest of the day, my phone buzzed with notifications, texts from friends offering support, calls from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. I let them all go to voicemail. I didn't need support. I needed stillness. The first casualty was Chloe. Her entire career, her entire identity, was built on a fragile scaffolding of online perception. She was a lifestyle influencer, a job that was as formidable as it was fictitious. Her currency was aspirational perfection. A video of her sneering about a community service diamond was pure poison to that brand. David called again the next day. "Her sponsors are dropping like flies," he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. The organic skincare company, the artisanal coffee subscription box, even the local boutique she promotes. It seems publicly shaming a beloved senior citizen isn't part of their brand identity. The comments on her social media are brutal. I felt a brief, sharp pang of something that might have been pity, but it passed. She had chosen to live by the sword of public opinion. It was only fitting she should fall by it. The consequences for my son, however, were what I truly dreaded. Ben's world was smaller than Chloe's, but his foundation was just as shaky. He was a real estate agent in a town where reputation was everything. People didn't just hire you to sell their house. They hired the person they trusted, the person they knew from Little League or the church bake sale. Character was your collateral. The call from Ben came on the third day. It wasn't a call, really. It was a message, left on my voicemail, his voice a ragged, panicked mess. Mom, you need to call me back. Mr. Henderson was at the ceremony. John Henderson. He pulled the Westfield listing this morning. $600,000, Mom. My biggest client. He told my boss it was a character issue. A character issue. My boss. He didn't fire me, but, Mom, this is bad. This is really bad. You have to call Henderson. You know him from the Historical Society. You have to explain it to him. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. You have to fix this. I listened to the message twice, standing in my quiet kitchen. The desperation in his voice, the raw terror a part of me, the mother in me, ached to hear it. That old instinct to soothe, to protect, to make it all better, rose up in me like a ghost, but I pushed it back down. Because underneath the panic, the same old story was playing out. You have to fix this. Not, I'm so sorry, Mom. Not, what I did was unforgivable. But, you need to clean up the mess I made. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was terrified of the price tag. I looked at the phone in my hand. It felt heavy. A direct line to a world of chaos and consequences I wanted no part of. For years, every time that phone had rung with his name, my stomach would clench. What now? What bill was late? What new scheme needed funding? What fresh drama needed my quiet, steady presence to absorb the shockwaves? I thought of the promise I'd made to Frank, in the quiet of his workshop. An inheritance of character. What kind of character was I building in my son by constantly shielding him from the fallout of his own? I was his firefighter, always rushing in to put out the blazes he and his flashy, flammable fiancée started. But in doing so, I'd never let him learn the simplest, most important lesson of all. If you play with fire, you will get burned. With a strange, sad sense of finality, I pressed the delete button. The message vanished. The phone fell silent. Outside my window, a blue jay landed on the bird feeder. The sun was shining. My house was quiet. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely, and peacefully alone with my decision. The fire was raging somewhere else, far away, and it was no longer my job to put it out. A fire you don't feed eventually burns itself out. After I deleted his message, a new kind of quiet settled over my life, a quiet that wasn't empty, but full of potential. The frantic ringing of the phone stopped. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The raw, open wound of the awards night began to scar over, leaving behind something tough and resilient. I was moving forward, pouring all my energy into fulfilling the promise I'd made to Frank. The scholarship was becoming real, a tangible thing of ink and paper and hope. I thought the silence from my son was the final word, the settled ash from a burned-out bridge. I was wrong. The final word came in a way I never expected. My days were filled with a purpose that hummed under my skin. David Chen had helped me set up a board for the foundation, and my dining room table, once the site of so much tension, was now perpetually covered in stacks of scholarship applications. Each folder was a small universe of a life, a story of a bright kid from a family that worked 2 jobs, a girl who wanted to be an astrophysicist, a boy who built robots in his garage. Their essays were full of that fierce, brilliant hope that only the young possess. Their small, grainy photos smiled up at me, a gallery of the future Frank had wanted to build. One rainy afternoon, I was sorting through the finalist applications when David forwarded me a link to an article on the local news website. The headline read, "Local Teachers' Legacy of Character Funds a New Generation of Scientists." It was a lovely piece, detailing Frank's invention and my decision to fund the scholarship. They'd interviewed the high school principal and some of my former colleagues. They called the whole story a lesson in quiet integrity. I sat there reading the words, a slow, deep sense of satisfaction warming me from the inside out. This was real. The good I had promised Frank I would do was taking root in the world. It was in that moment of quiet pride that my phone buzzed. A new voicemail. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew, with a sudden, gut-level certainty, who it was. My finger hovered over the delete button, the now familiar instinct to protect my peace rising up. But something made me pause. I pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was barely recognizable. It was Ben, but all the smooth, confident edges of his real estate agent persona had been sanded away. What was left was something raw and broken. "Mom," he began, his voice raspy. There was the sound of a bus hissing past in the background. He wasn't in his car. I know you don't want to hear from me. I get it. I saw the article online today. About the scholarship. About Dad." He took a shaky breath. "All this time, Mom, all this time, I thought the inheritance was the house. I was so stupid, so blind. Chloe, she's gone. The job is gone. The condo is gone. Everything we built it was just a house of cards. I kept thinking if I just had the money from the house I could fix it. I could build it all back. But that's not it, is it? His voice cracked, and for the first time, I heard not self-pity, but genuine, soul-deep confusion. The article used Dad's phrase, an inheritance of character. I've been sitting here on this bench for an hour just thinking about that. His real legacy wasn't the patent, was it? It was the idea behind it, the doing good part. That was the real fortune. And I didn't have the character to see it. I closed my eyes, picturing him on a park bench somewhere, the whole hollowed-out architecture of his life having crumbled around him. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, and the words were heavy with the weight of everything that had been broken. "Not because I got caught, not because I lost everything. I'm sorry for what I was, for not defending you, for looking at you and seeing an obstacle instead of my own mother, for letting God, Mom, I'm so sorry." There was a long silence, just the sound of the city in the background. I thought he had hung up. "You don't have to call me back," he said finally, his voice thick with tears. "I don't expect you to. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what I lost. It wasn't the money, it was everything else." The message ended. The phone went dark. I sat there in the quiet of my dining room, surrounded by the hopeful faces of the future. The application I was holding was from a girl who wanted to invent a new kind of water purification system. Her essay was full of passion and intelligence. She had character. Every instinct in me, every mothering cell in my body, wanted to call him back, to say, "It's okay, honey, come home." But I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. The boy who had been so desperate to get his hands on my house finally had a chance to build something of his own, a conscience. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. His beginning. And for the first time in his adult life, he would have to walk it alone. I picked up the girl's application again, a sad, complicated love for my lost son aching in my chest, and I got back to work. Work became my sanctuary. It became my purpose. In the months that followed, I poured everything I had not into the tangled, painful roots of the past, but into the rich, fertile soil of the future Frank and I had dreamed of. The house, once a silent battleground, was transformed. Its quiet halls no longer echoed with resentment, but hummed with a new and vibrant energy. The heart of this new life was in the one place that had always held the house's truest value: my husband's workshop. It wasn't a ghost's room anymore. The dust sheets were gone, the windows washed clean to let the bright afternoon sun stream in. The cold, lonely prototypes Frank had built were still there, displayed on a new shelf like honored ancestors. But now they had company. The air no longer smelled of old paper and ozone, but of fresh coffee, the warm plastic smell from a 3D printer, and the unmistakable, electric scent of a brilliant young mind hard at work. Her name was Maya. She was the first recipient of the Frank Vance STEM Scholarship, a whip-smart girl with eyes that shone with fierce intelligence. She was a chemical engineering student at the State University, and her current project was spread all over Frank's old workbench: colorful diagrams, complex equations scrawled on a whiteboard, and a series of small 3D printed models. She was trying to build on Frank's work to create a version of his polymer that could be used to filter microplastics from ocean water. I would spend hours down there with her, not as a teacher, but as a student. She would try to explain the science to me, her hands moving with excitement, and I would make sure she remembered to eat, bringing her sandwiches and hot tea. We were an unlikely team, a 7 3-year-old retired teacher and a 9-year-old scientific prodigy, but we were building something together. She was the daughter I'd never had, the future Frank had only dreamed of. She was his true legacy. One afternoon, while Maya was at the university library, I was cleaning up our coffee mugs when my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. It had been exactly 1 year since the awards ceremony. 1 year since my old life had been demolished to make way for this one. On a strange impulse, I went to my voicemail and scrolled all the way to the bottom, to the one saved message I had never deleted. I pressed play. Ben's broken, tearful voice filled the quiet workshop. "I finally understand what I lost. It wasn't the money, it was everything else." I listened to the whole message, to the sound of the bus hissing past, to the raw and painful honesty in his apology. A year ago, that message had been a source of a sad, complicated ache. Now, it just sounded distant, like a story about someone I used to know. The rage was gone. The deep, soul-crushing hurt was gone. All that was left was a quiet, mournful love for the son I had raised, and a profound sense of peace for the man I had finally set free to find his own way. He had not called again. I heard through a cousin that he had moved to another state, that he was working a simple construction job, living in a small apartment. He was starting over, from the ground up, with his own two hands. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally building an inheritance of his own. With a steady finger, I pressed the delete button. A small pop-up asked, "Are you sure?" I smiled. A real, genuine smile. I was sure. I pressed yes, and the last remnant of that battle vanished into the ether. My face wasn't turned toward the past anymore. My work was here, in this room with the future. My story isn't a fairy tale. The family wasn't magically put back together. The broken pieces were not glued into place, because I've learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on, but letting go. I learned that you cannot let the people you love, even your own children, define your worth or dictate your peace. Your life, your home, your legacy, they are not assets to be liquidated. They are the sum total of your character, and that is a treasure beyond price. It's never too late to put a lock on the door, to guard the promises you've made to yourself, and to build a new life from a better blueprint. So let me ask you, if you found yourself standing on a foundation that was crumbling, not from age, but from disrespect, would you have the courage to build somewhere new? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your words and your own stories give strength to so many others. And please consider subscribing for more stories about finding the courage to write your own next chapter. Thank you for listening.